Mike Bell, a visual effects supervisor at MPC, guides us through the creation of Game of Thrones prequel House of the Dragon. That's those fantasy stories set entirely within their own worlds, far from ours, is popular. It always has been on some scale, but in the past couple of decades its visual potential for film and television has flourished. One of the high fantasy stories that has enjoyed huge popularity has been Game of Thrones. The original series concluded in 2019, and in autumn 2022 a prequel series entitled House of the Dragon reached TV screens. Its rich fantasy world palette has again captivated audiences. The series has provided a dazzling opportunity for visual effects and animation to be showcased in the creation of a medieval inflected world of castles and coastlines, elemental powers and, of course, dragons. 3D World recently had a conversation with Mike Bell, VFX supervisor at MPC under the direction of Angus Bickerton, about the studio's work for the series. Like a dragon surveying its terrain, the conversation ranged across the big-picture visual spectacle of House of the Dragon and also the smaller, more nuanced effects and animation work undertaken. Bell has worked in visual effects for years, and at points in the conversation his sense of wonder at the process he knows so well shone through. House of the Dragon vividly builds on the established visual language of its predecessor while also being a prequel to that story. Bell explains, "The material of what came before was great and was established over a number of years. We had all these maps and demographic areas, and the brief was that King's Landing shouldn't be so established. This did change over time. King's Landing already had its layout and map. In the previous seasons they'd move things around for cinematic effect. There were stricter guidelines regarding certain settings and spaces in the new series. King's Landing had certain districts, like the area around the Red Keep. The houses were to be no higher than 2 floors. It's not quite so built up, but the roads should generally stay in the same place." Of the overarching visual tone of the new series, Bell notes the influence of Miguel Sapochnik, the co-showrunner and director. He definitely had a vision of it feeling dirtier and grittier, with more muted tones, which is a link to later episodes of the Game of Thrones series. And he wanted lots of floating dust and pollen pretty much on everything. Our conversation then turns to the titular dragons and the world in which they are shown. The previous visual effects studio, Pixamondo, who also did some work on House of the Dragon, had established a look over time. And by the end of the original Game of Thrones the dragon textures were very good. We wanted to pick up where they left off, try and improve on it, and go from there. We certainly had freedom. In terms of playing with the animation and developing the characters of the dragons, and that was very specific. They all had different characteristics and those were developed over time. Bell makes a note too about the live action and animation dynamic, explaining that, for example, when Matt Smith, as the character Daemon Targaryen, is seen on a dragon, there were 2 approaches taken. If it was a wide enough shot, it was a digi-double. If it was closer, they shot stuff on a buck unit. While MPC has a wealth of experience across TV series and features. New projects typically mean new challenges, and Bell quickly broke down particularly testing and rewarding sequences that he and his team worked on. He begins by identifying Episode 3 as a highlight in this respect. We did 2 big battle sequences. The first was the opening nighttime battle on Bloodstone Beach. That was a challenge because it was so unique. When we saw the previs, I felt we hadn't seen anything quite like that before. It was all at night, and the fire from the dragon, and the fire scattered around the beach, and the quarry was the only lighting that we were supposed to have. The environment was full CG. They shot all of the battle on the backlit at Leavesden. Bell makes the point that the live-action shoot was very minimal in terms of the set construction and decor. There were a few foreground things, like archers on green screen that had been placed here and there, and people running and scattering, but I remember that when it got turned over to us we were like, oh, it's everything that we have to create. I was surprised at how little we had to work with, but, in some ways, it freed us up to experiment a bit. Our input was very meticulously prevised for the bigger action sequences, but they changed over time. The edit was constantly changing. For the early battle, at the opening of episode 3, it was a case of building something and then throwing it all away into shadow and only having it lit up in certain areas. And it was a really appealing idea. I tend to like that, not showing so much, revealing things, and then suddenly there's a burst of fire and it lights the dragon up. The challenge on that was that the opening had lots of plates before the dragon arrived, and from that point it was pretty much all CG, of the later battle scene. Bell acknowledges that its challenge lay in the fact that it was longer than the first and it was in the daytime, so we saw a lot more. Amid the dragons, battles, parapets, coastlines and raging elements of House of the Dragon. The series has also showcased what we might think of as more nuanced, more delicate work, and Bell has a particular example of that kind of challenge. He talks about the work undertaken in the digital makeup applied to Paddy Considine's live-action performance as King Viserys. That was a particular challenge, something that was completely unique. Under our supervision, a lot of that work was done by the mill. Viserys had to look emaciated, like he had lost weight. What was quite interesting is how that was very nuanced work, because it was a very emotional episode and Paddy Considine's performance was fantastic. And you don't ever want to take away from that. What was great about this was that there's no uncanny valley to detract from the performance. Bell then catalogues the specifics of the work. It was tough, minute work, warping, tracking sections of skin texture, and grading to contour the face to make his jawline seem thinner. It was almost unnoticeable. Another reason that worked so well was because the makeup department had done a really good job on anyway with skin texture and wounds. The ethos was use as much of this as possible, and so we always use the plate eyes and mouth, and then detail around that can change. The CG elements were duly created, Bell explains. A CG cheek and eye had to be tracked into the emaciated version, and the methodology of that was scary. When we were shooting, it was like, well, this is how I think it should be done. But you never really know until you get on with it, because you have to meticulously body track every single aspect. So that was a very interesting challenge. The world's production and post-production work dovetailed throughout the course of the extensive schedule, with digital work enhancing, expanding and sometimes entirely creating the environments. Bell recalls work undertaken at Leavesden for a scene set on a beach. He notes how, in the finished episode, we see Matt Smith running from one end of the beach to the other. It wasn't as long as that. Over 6 days they redressed it every day, a bit further along. Because it was shot over a number of days, the challenge with that was consistency. The lighting was different on every day, and so we had to make the lighting cohesive. Also, when you build these big environments, you're never sure which section is going to be used. Bell also explains that each shot has to combine in a visually coherent way. Pretty much every shot has to have improvements made to get the quality of the textures right. We had the dragon, the environment, the sand, smoke, digi-double crowds battling, and buck unit stuff for whoever is flying a dragon. We bring all of those elements together. Of MPC's necessary work on set, he explains the value of that for the actors, as it provides specific visual information to have in mind when filming against blue screen. I think it does help. Angus Bickerton very much wanted to get a lot of that information. The actors and directors have seen the previs. They know the tone of the sequence and know the scale. Indicative of this way of working, Bell says, are episodes 6 and 9 of the series, as well as the creation of the Dragon Pit environment. Those dragon pit sequences were shot on 360-degree blue screen because the environment is basically like a kind of internal Wembley Stadium. And shooting that, you just don't know what you would be looking at. You have a ball on a stick for eyeline, but where it helps to have that previs is for the scale of the environment. When you arrive, it's a huge studio, but it's nowhere near as big as it's supposed to be. There are extras there and they all need to be aware of how big this setting is. You've got 100 extras but there's supposed to be 50,000, and so you're not just acting to the people in front of you, you're acting in relation to the whole of the environment. There was a team of people that Angus brought in when they took the previs environment and placed the dragon in the middle of that environment. You'd put on a kind of AR headset and suddenly it was like, wow, the dragon's that big, and, wow, the environment's that big. The AR set roughly knew where people were in space. I loved the AR. You could walk around the dragon. It was like jumping into a VR version of a video game and you become aware of how big the environment is. Bell then sketches out how beneficial the AR headset was. A 360-degree blue screen is helpful in some ways, but during a shoot it's not helpful for feeling the environment. So if someone was in front of the dragon, the headset automatically rotated them out and put them in front of the dragon. If you were behind the dragon, it automatically put them behind. Then, for the actors that were stood at a slightly elevated position, they'd put the headset on and say, okay, the dragon's this big. I need to be looking in this area and that's where the top tier of the stadium is. That really helped, Bell adds with a laugh. But once the headset was removed, it was back to, eyes follow the ball. For House of the Dragon, MPC employed sizable teams across all disciplines. Mike Bell details the size of the team he worked with across MPC's international studio network. It was a lot. It was supervised from our office in London and we had a team of around 100 people in Montreal. We had a roto and match move team in Bangalore. We had our senior team in London. Overall, including leads, supervision, artists and production, it peaked at 400 to 500 people. A lot had to go through me. We were able to split it up into a number of units, each with their own leads. Bell says the episodic pipeline MPC has developed over the years is different to his previous work in films. MPC's pipeline is very robust, with all of the disciplines running at the same time and funneling together. The pipeline is built to be malleable. I worked in features for about 14 years. In some ways, episodic production is harder than features because the shoot is longer. For example, you have a team working on episode 1 and 2 while they're still shooting 5 and 6, and you're prepping for 7 and 8. Prior to working in episodic TV, film was where post was done after the shoot. Juggling the shoot and the VFX work tends to happen much more in episodic production. It's harder because you're always in delivery mode, you have a staggered delivery. You ramp up and then you stay up. Mike Bell talks through the challenges of teamwork for House of the Dragon. Every show is unique and there are so many variables. Because it was practically a full CG show, House of the Dragon had environments, fully CG battles, and crowd sequences. We definitely had the freedom to create not just the technical pipeline but create the team that made it work for that. We split it into teams for FX simulations, environments and animation, all of which had to work hand in hand, because there's lots of crossover. It changes over time, obviously, because you just get that vibe of, oh, this has to happen here, this has to happen there. You have to shuffle it around.